Imagine a time not so long ago when the entire world was caught in two enormous conflicts. These were not just ordinary wars, they were world wars. They involved countries from every corner of the globe, from the bustling cities of Europe to the quiet islands of the Pacific. The first of these, known as World War I or the Great War, raged from 1914 to 1918. People at the time called it the war to end all wars. They hoped that after such a terrible fight, humanity would never want to experience anything like it again. It was a brutal, grinding conflict that changed the way wars were fought forever. Sadly, that hope for lasting peace did not become a reality. Just over 20 years later, a second, even more destructive war began. This was World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945. This conflict was bigger, faster, and deadlier than the first. It brought new technologies of destruction and spread to even more parts of the world. Together, these two wars completely reshaped our planet. They redrew maps, toppled empires, and created new nations. They also changed how people lived, what they believed in, and the very structure of our global society. Understanding these two epic battles is crucial to understanding the world we live in today. The decisions made by leaders, the courage shown by ordinary people, and the immense suffering they endured have left a deep mark on our history. These wars were turning points that set the stage for the modern era. They influenced everything from international politics and technology to the rights we value and the international organizations we rely on, like the United Nations. Looking back at these events helps us appreciate the peace we often take for granted and understand the dangers of conflict. In this journey through history, we will explore both of these monumental wars. We will look at why they started, who fought in them, and what life was like for soldiers and civilians. We will walk through the major battles that turned the tide and see how each war finally came to an end. Most importantly, we will uncover the lasting legacy of these conflicts and discover why it is so important for us today on July 23, 2025. To remember these epic struggles, it is a story of tragedy, heroism, and incredible change, a story that belongs to all of us. The world in the early 1900s was like a pile of dry wood waiting for a spark. Tensions were incredibly high between the great powers of Europe. Countries were building huge armies and navies in a massive arms race, each trying to be stronger than its neighbors. Great Britain and Germany, for example, were competing to build the most powerful battleships. This competition created a lot of suspicion and fear. At the same time, nations were forming complex alliances, promising to defend each other if one was attacked. These pacts were meant to keep the peace, but they actually made a large-scale war more likely. The main alliances divided Europe into two armed camps. On one side were the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. On the other side were the Allied Powers, or the Entente, primarily made up of France, Great Britain, and Russia. These alliances meant that a small conflict between two nations could quickly pull many other countries into the fight. It was a dangerous domino effect waiting to happen. Nationalism was also a powerful force. Many groups of people wanted their own independent countries, which created instability within large empires like Austria-Hungary. The spark that finally lit the fire came on a summer day in 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was visiting the city of Sarajevo. He and his wife, Sophie, were assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. This shocking event set off a rapid chain reaction. Austria-Hungary, furious at the murder, blamed Serbia and made a series of harsh demands. When Serbia did not agree to all of them, Austria-Hungary declared war. This single act triggered the complex web of alliances. Because of the alliances, the conflict quickly spiraled out of control. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Serbia, began to mobilize its massive army. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, saw Russia's mobilization as a threat and declared war on Russia. Then Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally, and invaded Belgium to get to Paris quickly. This invasion of neutral Belgium brought Great Britain into the war, as Britain had promised to protect Belgium's neutrality. Within just a few weeks, a regional dispute had exploded into a full-blown European war, the Great War. When World War I began, most people believed it would be over by Christmas. The soldiers marched off to war with excitement, thinking they were heading for a grand adventure. However, the reality of the war was very different and far more horrifying. On the Western Front, which ran through France and Belgium, the war quickly bogged down into a stalemate. Both sides dug vast networks of trenches, stretching for hundreds of miles from the Swiss border to the North Sea. These trenches became the defining feature of the war, a muddy, miserable world of their own. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. Soldiers lived in constant fear of enemy attacks, artillery shells and sniper fire. The conditions were terrible. The trenches were often filled with mud and water, leading to diseases like trench foot. Rats were everywhere, and soldiers had to deal with lice and other pests. The space between the opposing trenches was called no man's land. It was a barren wasteland of mud, shell craters and barbed wire. To attack, soldiers had to climb over the top of their trench and charge across no man's land, facing a hail of machine gun fire. Several major battles of World War I became infamous for their staggering number of casualties. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 is one of the most tragic examples. On the very first day of the battle, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest day in its history. The battle lasted for months and resulted in over 1 million men killed or wounded on all sides, for a gain of only a few miles of territory. Similarly, the Battle of Verdun, also in 1916, was a brutal, long-lasting struggle between French and German forces, resulting in immense losses for both. The war was not just fought on the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, the fighting between Russia and the Central Powers was more mobile, but just as deadly. Battles also took place in the Middle East, Africa, and at sea. New technologies made the war even more destructive. Machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, tanks and airplanes were used for the first time on a massive scale. These new weapons changed warfare forever, but in World War I, they mostly contributed to the deadlock and the horrific scale of death and destruction, a brutal stalemate that would last for years. By 1917, after 3 long years of brutal fighting, the course of the Great War began to shift significantly. One of the most important events was the entry of the United States into the conflict. For years, America had remained neutral, but several factors pushed it to join the Allied powers. German submarines had been sinking ships in the Atlantic, including passenger liners with American citizens on board. The final straw was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, proposing an alliance against the United States. In April 1917, America declared war, bringing fresh troops and vast industrial resources to the Allied cause. At the same time, major changes were happening on the Eastern Front. Russia, which had suffered enormous losses, was in turmoil. The country was exhausted by the war, and its people were facing severe food shortages. This led to the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Tsar was overthrown, and eventually the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, came to power. They wanted to pull Russia out of the war immediately. In early 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, with Germany officially ending its involvement in the conflict. This allowed Germany to move all its troops to the Western Front for one final push. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched a massive series of attacks on the Western Front known as the Spring Offensive. They hoped to win the war before the American forces could arrive in large numbers. At first, the offensive was successful and German troops pushed deep into Allied territory. However, the Allies, now reinforced by fresh American soldiers, managed to hold the line. They then launched a powerful counterattack known as the 100 Days Offensive. Using coordinated attacks with tanks, infantry and aircraft, the Allies began to push the exhausted German army back. The German military and home front were collapsing. After years of naval blockade, the German people were starving and the will to fight was gone. Germany's allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, also surrendered. Faced with defeat, the German Kaiser abdicated and a new government was formed. On November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, an armistice was signed and the fighting finally stopped. The Great War was over. The world celebrated, but the peace that followed was fragile. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany, which would create deep resentment and help sow the seeds for another world war. The peace that ended World War I was, unfortunately, a troubled one. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war, was intended to prevent another conflict, but in many ways it did the opposite. The treaty placed all the blame for the war on Germany and forced it to pay huge sums of money called reparations. Germany also lost territory and had to drastically reduce its military. These harsh terms created a strong sense of humiliation and anger among the German people. This resentment provided fertile ground for extremist leaders who promised to restore Germany's national pride and strength. During the 1920s and 30s, the world was also hit by a severe economic crisis known as the Great Depression. It started in the United States in 1929 and quickly spread across the globe. Businesses failed, banks closed, and millions of people lost their jobs and savings. In this climate of economic hardship and uncertainty, many people lost faith in their democratic governments. They were drawn to powerful, authoritarian leaders who offered simple solutions to complex problems. In several countries, totalitarian regimes rose to power, promising order and national glory. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party took control. In Japan, military leaders gained more and more power, pushing for aggressive expansion to secure resources for their island nation. Most significantly, in Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rose to prominence. Hitler was a charismatic speaker who skillfully exploited the German people's anger over the Treaty of Versailles and the economic crisis. He promised to rebuild the German military, reclaim lost territories, and create a powerful German empire. By 1933, he had become the leader of Germany, establishing a brutal dictatorship. These aggressive new powers began to challenge the international order. Japan invaded Manchuria in China in 1931. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Germany, under Hitler, began to openly defy the Treaty of Versailles by rearming its military and reoccupying the Rhineland. The main Allied powers from World War I, Britain and France, were reluctant to confront these actions. They hoped to avoid another war through a policy of appeasement, giving in to Hitler's demands in the hope that he would be satisfied. This policy ultimately failed, as it only emboldened Hitler to become more aggressive, leading the world down the path to another, even more devastating global conflict. Section 6. A global conflict, the main events of World War II. World War II began in Europe on September 1, 1939, when Adolf Hitler's Germany invaded Poland. Hitler had already annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and his invasion of Poland was really the final straw for Britain and France. They had promised to defend Poland, and just 2 days later they declared war on Germany. This marked the start of the second major global conflict in just over 2 decades. The main combatants were the Axis powers, led by Germany, Italy and Japan, and the Allied powers, which eventually included Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States and China. The early years of the war were dominated by Axis victories. Germany used a new military tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This involved fast, coordinated attacks using tanks, planes and infantry to overwhelm the enemy quickly. Using this strategy, Germany rapidly conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands and France. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood almost alone against the might of Hitler's empire. The Battle of Britain was a crucial air campaign where the British Royal Air Force successfully defended the UK against large-scale attacks by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, preventing a German invasion. The war expanded dramatically in 1941. In June, Hitler made a fateful decision to break his pact with Joseph Stalin and invade the Soviet Union. This opened up the vast Eastern Front, which would become the largest and bloodiest theater of the war. Millions of soldiers fought in brutal conditions, and the conflict there was a turning point. Then, on December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This attack brought the United States, with its immense industrial power, into the war on the side of the Allies. With the entry of the Soviet Union and the United States, the war truly became a global struggle. Fighting raged across Europe, North Africa, Asia and the Pacific. The war was also a total war, meaning it involved entire societies. Factories were converted to produce weapons, food was rationed, and civilians were targeted in bombing raids. The conflict was also marked by horrific atrocities, most notably the Holocaust. the systematic genocide in which Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered some 6 million European Jews. The scale and brutality of the conflict were absolutely unprecedented in human history. Section 7. Turning the tide: key battles that decided the Second World War. Several key battles and campaigns were critical turning points in World War II, shifting the momentum in favor of the Allied powers. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from late 1942 to early 1943, was one of the most important. The German army tried to capture the city of Stalingrad, but they were met with fierce resistance from the Soviet Red Army. After months of brutal street-to-street fighting, the Soviets surrounded and trapped the entire German Sixth Army. The German surrender at Stalingrad was a catastrophic defeat for Hitler and marked the beginning of the long Soviet push back towards Germany. In the Pacific Theater, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a decisive naval victory for the United States against Japan. Just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US Navy managed to sink 4 of Japan's most important aircraft carriers. This victory crippled the Japanese Navy and ended its period of expansion across the Pacific. After Midway, the United States and its allies began a long and difficult island-hopping campaign, gradually capturing key islands and moving closer to Japan. This battle permanently shifted the balance of sea power in the Pacific. Back in Europe, the Allies prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history, the invasion of Normandy, France. This operation, known as D-Day, took place on June 6, 1944. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other nations landed on the beaches of Normandy under heavy German fire. It was a costly but successful operation that established a crucial second front in Western Europe. From Normandy, the Allies began the slow and difficult process of liberating France and pushing eastwards towards Germany, squeezing Hitler's empire from both the west and the east. The war in Europe came to an end in the spring of 1945. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin from both sides, Hitler took his own life on April 30th. A few days later, on May 8th, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. This day is known as Victory in Europe Day, or VE-Day. However, the war in the Pacific continued. The United States, seeking to avoid a costly invasion of Japan, made the difficult decision to use a new and terrible weapon. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Faced with this unimaginable destruction, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, finally bringing World War II to an end. Section 8. A world transformed: the aftermath of 2 global wars. The end of World War I and World War II left the world profoundly and permanently changed. The human cost alone was staggering. World War I resulted in an estimated 20 million deaths, both soldiers and civilians, while World War II was even deadlier, with estimates ranging from 70 to 85 million people killed. Entire cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and countless people were left homeless and displaced. The psychological trauma of these wars also lingered for generations, shaping the attitudes and fears of those who survived. The world that emerged from the ashes was a very different place. Politically, the world map was redrawn twice. After World War I, great empires like the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires collapsed, giving way to new independent nations in Europe and the Middle East. After World War II, the age of European colonial empires came to an end. Countries in Africa and Asia, which had contributed soldiers and resources to the war effort, began to demand and win their independence. The old European powers like Britain and France were weakened, and 2 new superpowers emerged to dominate the global stage: the United States and the Soviet Union. The devastation of the 2 wars also led to a strong desire for international cooperation to prevent future conflicts. After World War I, the League of Nations was created, but it ultimately failed to stop the aggression that led to World War II. Learning from this failure, the world's leaders created a new organization in 1945, the United Nations. The UN was designed to be a more effective body for maintaining international peace and security, promoting human rights and encouraging cooperation between nations. It remains a central pillar of our global order today, a direct legacy of the world's desire to avoid another such catastrophe. The end of World War II also ushered in a new kind of global conflict, the Cold War. The United States, with its democratic and capitalist ideology, and the Soviet Union, with its communist ideology, became rivals. They never fought each other directly in a hot war, but they competed for influence around the world for decades. This rivalry led to a nuclear arms race, proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam, and the division of Europe by an Iron Curtain. This new global structure, a direct result of the war's outcome, would define international politics for the next 45 years. Section 9. Lest we forget why we must remember these epic battles. Remembering the epic battles of World War I and World War II is more than just a history lesson. It is a vital responsibility for all of us living today. These wars were not distant, abstract events. They were fought by ordinary people, grandparents and great-grandparents, who faced extraordinary circumstances. We remember their sacrifice to honor the millions who lost their lives, the soldiers who fought on the front lines, and the civilians who endured bombings, occupation, and hardship. Their stories of courage, resilience, and suffering are a powerful reminder of the human cost of conflict and the preciousness of peace. By studying these wars, we can also learn crucial lessons about how conflicts begin. We see the dangers of extreme nationalism, the failure of diplomacy, and the terrible consequences of aggression and intolerance. The path to both wars shows how easily fear and hatred can be manipulated by leaders to justify violence. Understanding the causes, the tangled alliances of 1914 or the policy of appeasement in the 1930s, helps us to recognize similar warning signs in our own time. It teaches us the importance of international cooperation, communication, and standing up to injustice before it grows into a global threat. Furthermore, the world we inhabit today was forged in the crucible of these two wars. The international institutions we rely on, like the United Nations, and the principles of human rights and self-determination, were born from the desire to create a better world after such immense destruction. Technological and medical advancements, from penicillin and radar to jet engines and computers, were accelerated by the demands of war. Our modern society, with its complex global connections and its ongoing struggles for peace and justice, cannot be fully understood without looking back at these defining moments of the 20th century. Ultimately, we remember these epic battles so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. The phrase "lest we forget" is not just a slogan, it is a solemn promise to future generations. It is a commitment to work for peace, to value diplomacy, and to cherish our shared humanity. As we stand here on July the 23rd, 2025, looking back at a century of history, the stories of these wars remind us that peace is not guaranteed. It is something that must be actively built and protected by each and every one of us. Remembering is our duty, and it is our best hope for a more peaceful future.